wisdom. Allow your wisdom to wash over us today as we talk about positions that are not true, but we recognize that people do believe them, and for various reasons, but we know that you want all men to come to your heart, all men and women to come to your light. So let us pray for them and for us, that we might be strengthened as we pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. St. Thomas More, pray for us. Okay, well, thank you all for being here. This is the third seminar in the summer, 3 of 5. So very grateful for you all being here. And feel free throughout the time to get up, get some more Dunkin'. I'm not paid to say that, even though I lived in Boston for the last 4 years almost. So, although maybe they should pay me to say that. But so feel free to get up during this. Don't worry about it. It is live streamed on the parish YouTube page, and then later on my own YouTube page, but not the Q&A. So nothing that you say during the Q&A is going to be recorded. So that gives you more freedom of expression, freedom of thought. But this part will be recorded for our church audience. It will be live streamed as well. So just a heads up on that, but don't let that stop you from getting up. They would probably do the same if they were here, but we thank our online audience for being here. Okay, great. So this is the first talk in a 3-part series on different positions or beliefs that we as Catholics acknowledge. Maybe a desire for truth there, or a little bit of the truth, but ultimately it's going to be a falsity or a lie with these positions. And so it's not to assume any motive or desire of the heart of any person who holds any of these positions, right? People can be mistaken at times in varying ways, but it is to say that we can love the sinner but hate the sin, love the disbeliever but hate the disbelief, right? So that sort of idea in charity, because charity and love go together, right? St. Paul makes that pretty clear for us as Christians. And so the first talk today, it's going to be about atheism and agnosticism. And we'll talk about what those means in a second. And then the next one is going to be kind of bad philosophical positions, okay? So that's going to be pro-LGBT agenda, pro-legal abortion, and other things, right? So that's probably the most controversial of the week, and it's only going to be for teenagers and for adults. But this and every other talk this summer is for everyone, for families, for children, so everyone can listen to this. And then the third one on Friday, so this one is obviously today. The next one's on Thursday, and the one after that is going to be on Friday. It's going to be arguing against positions of other religions, right? So we recognize that, as Vatican II talks about, there's a lot of light in a lot of religions, but they don't have the fullness of the faith, right? They don't have the full deposit of faith, as we would say in Catholic terms, but ultimately what that's just saying is they don't have the fullness of truth, right? All the graces, all the truth that God wants to give to everyone, right? Because we're all God's beloved creatures, right? So that's sort of the format of it. And again, they're all going to be 9:30 a.m., and it's going to be 45 minutes of lecturing. You have to get through purgatory before you get to heaven, so to speak, because heaven's more like dialogue, and lectures more like purgatory. It's a monologue, so can never help myself but make that joke. Okay, great. So yeah, that'll be the next 45 minutes, and again, they're all 9:30 to 10:30, promptly ending at 10:30. So, okay, great. Okay, so atheism and agnosticism, those are kind of loaded terms. You've probably heard them. You've probably had a nephew or, sadly, son or daughter or something who came home one day from college and said, I'm an agnostic or I'm an atheist or something like that, right? So this hits very close to home to us, and yeah, there's a lot of emotions involved, but we're going to come at it from, put on our philosopher hats and come at it from a strictly rational perspective. I'm just going to give you the arguments, right? How you talk to someone who may hold one or multiple of these arguments, that's going to be prudential, and there's more wisdom and more truth to be said about that than in one 45-minute lecture, okay? But I'm just going to give you the kind of lowdown on why I don't think those positions hold water at the end of the day, why they're not true at the end of the day, and we'll go from there, okay? So atheism, there's different forms and different ways to phrase it, but it basically comes down to one not believing that God exists, okay? I don't believe or I don't think that God exists. So it's a positive claim. It's a stronger claim, right? And if you make any claim, right? If you say that I saw the fire truck going down Palm Valley Road earlier this morning, and someone cared enough to ask you, okay, like how do you know that? You would have to have evidence for that, right? So you would have to say I saw it, right? I saw it, or even better yet, I got a video of it for some reason. You were very interested in that. But you need evidence to make a positive claim, right? That something happened, something is the way that it is, okay? So it's different, and it begs more evidence than agnosticism, okay? So agnosticism, basically, again, there's more ways to put it, but it's basically saying, I don't know if God exists, right? Or I don't think we can know that God exists, okay? So this is kind of the weaker version of atheism. And it's more intellectually tenable. I don't think it's true, but we'll talk about why in a minute, okay? So probably most people, if not everyone in this room, would take the position that disagrees with both of these positions, and which I agree with, called theism, okay? So theism is basically the positive. We believe that God exists, and we think that there's evidence for this, okay? We as Catholics take, if you are a Catholic in the audience here, a stronger view on what the evidence is, but most Christians would say we can know that God exists, or we at least can believe that God exists with evidence, right? Because that's, again, a positive claim. You have to have been able to have seen the fire truck, so to speak, or taken a video of it, in order to make that claim. So you have to have some kind of positive evidence to make that claim, okay? So it's a little bit in the weeds, but anyway, you have a stronger version and a weaker version of the arguments, and they're called atheism and agnosticism, okay? And so just to set the stage here, again, in the more secular America we have now, I think it has touched close to home for many people, and it's, yeah, kind of in the water, this kind of practical atheism. But it is high stakes, just a intellectual understanding of it, right? So if atheism is true, then most, if not all of us here, are kind of walking around with our imaginary friends, right? If atheism is true, God doesn't exist. And so what we say is the most important person to us, right? Even more so than the people we live with, our friends, our neighbors, everyone we know and have seen, is not as real, in a real sense, than God, right? Who most people today, people of the Abrahamic faiths, know as a person, as a willing intellect and mind and being, okay? So this person who's most important for us, who gives meaning, who gives structure to things, who can even communicate with us, right? In prayer, we talked about that last week, right? This being is actually an imaginary friend, as real as that 3-year-old who talks about his or her imaginary friend. So, in other words, theists are crazy if atheism is true. Again, I don't think it's true. But if it is true, you can see how high the stakes are and how controversial of a claim it is to say that God exists, understood in the classical way, that like the ancient Greeks, Aristotle, the better ones intellectually, and the Christians and the Jews and the Muslims perceive God to be. So high stakes, but if you look at it on the other end, right, if we're right, if theism is true, okay, that's kind of like, and you're an atheist, that's kind of like saying that you go home after college, after the semester, and you accept all the gifts that your parents give you, but you completely ignore them in communication, so you don't say anything or hear anything of them ever. So it's certifiably bananas as well. So you can see that would be crazy, that would be evil. And so in the same way, if we're treating, this, what is in reality, if atheism is true, an imaginary friend with the highest importance and regard, that also is crazy and immoral. So you can't get out of the dilemma. Agnosticism, right, we'll talk about it. Maybe it is true, maybe it isn't. At the end of the day, we're going to see that that doesn't really hold water, and it forces a choice, right? Either to believe in God or not, and they're both very controversial, whichever one is true, right? Okay. So that's kind of the stakes, because it seems like, on Sundays, some people go play bingo, I go to Mass, we just kind of live the same life besides that. But in reality, objectively, behind the scenes, behind the veil, it means everything if God exists or if God doesn't. So even though that's kind of the implied culture in the country today, that is just kind of something you do on Sunday and it makes you feel good. Bingo makes me feel good. You can do what you want. It's actually means the most if God exists or doesn't exist. Okay. So it's a big deal, we see. And we'll take those arguments seriously because, they're not the worst arguments. I don't think they're very good. But we'll address them one by one. That's how you eat an elephant, right? So, okay. And again, I kind of said this before, but just to reemphasize it, I'm not assuming any level of malice, right, with these analogies or any of my arguments, right? The positions themselves are different from the people who hold them, and I don't assume someone is like holding to atheism because they want to do immoral things and it's inconvenient that God exists, right? I don't assume that of anyone, right? And so we shouldn't either. We should be charitable, as much as we can, make right judgments, but be charitable, right? And so I don't assume anyone, is like evil for holding to atheism, right? So, and neither should you. Okay. So let's kind of look at the other side's claims first, because even if I made the greatest argument for theism ever, right, but never addressed the other side's claims, they would just kind of both be floating there, and we wouldn't really know what to make of them. Okay, so we'll address kind of the negative side first: agnosticism and atheism. Okay. So again, agnosticism is more of the weaker claim. Okay, so it's more associated with an epistemological question. That's a big word, and I haven't known what that meant all my life, right? That's a word that most people don't know, and for good reason. It's too long and too academic. But it basically means like how I know things, right? So I know that someone, like that we were talking about earlier, stick with that. The fire truck went down the road because I saw it, right? I trust my vision, I trust my sense data, and for good reason, right? Someone might make a claim against that, but we don't have to go there. I don't think it's very strong not to trust your senses. But we see that we have tools or instruments to know the world, right? To know what's in reality. And this is very much associated with both our immaterial nature and our material nature, right? So we trust our sense data. There might be a stick in the water that looks like it's broken in two, but it's really one, okay? Well, then we use our immaterial nature to say that, there's a scientific principle there. It's called light refraction. And what's going on there is the stick is one, but it looks like to the naked eye that it's actually two. But there's some scientific reason for that associated with the water and the light and how that looks when beamed up, if you will, into our own eyes, right? Until the vision gets there. Those are kind of describing in rough terms. But you can see that we can generally trust our senses, but when it comes to certain things like that, and certain moral things too, our reason has to kick in, knowing what the end of things are, telos in the Greek, knowing what things are for, right? We know this, yes, in conjunction with what we see and what we know through our senses, but also through our reason, right? And you can make arguments for reason that go above just brain chemistry, but for the sake of time, we'll move on here. Okay, so again, this agnosticism is more of an epistemological claim, how we can know things, and especially how we can know things related to religious truth, right? Especially in this context, right? So oftentimes, an agnostic will be misinformed, right, or ignorant on the credibility, attestation, evidence that backs or doesn't back religious truth claims, right? So it's true that some religions don't really need any historical grounding based on their own claims, right? So one example of this, which is famous in American culture too, is Buddhism, right? If I said that Buddha didn't exist, and I spent my whole life making academic arguments to this effect, a Buddhist wouldn't really care. He would say, okay, and so we see that they're more concerned about, they're more trying to practice a timeless philosophy. That doesn't really matter in terms of the Buddha really lived at this time, if he even existed at all, right? I think he did, but even if you were to say that, they would say that doesn't really matter for my religion. And they would be right, because all they're concerned about is wisdom, right? Living according to reason or nature. And so some religions, you have to make distinctions, are more focused on that or only focused on that. And then other ones will make historical arguments and claims that ground them in a true reality in what happened in human history, with God reaching down, so to speak, and touching and affecting human history and human beings, right? Now, the other key distinction when talking about religions here is not just what they're claiming, but how they're claiming it or how good they're making their arguments, okay? So if you are trying to make arguments for Mormonism, I wouldn't be convinced, right? And that's because even though they have historical claims, right, which is good, and I think we can see and they accept the Old Testament, we see a loving providential God, right? And then we as Christians would also say the New Testament, right, what happened with Jesus about 2,000 years ago, was important and can be credible and is credible and historically verifiable. But with the Mormons, so they'll accept all that, but they'll also add on top of that the Book of Mormon, okay? So the Book of Mormon, I think it probably describes other things too, but a lot of it is associated with the historical happenings of a 13th tribe of Israel that went to the Americas some time ago, thousands of years ago. So, this is an interesting claim to begin with if you read the Old Testament and the New Testament, particularly the Old Testament here. But if you read the Book of Mormon, right, and then you try to go to the archaeological evidence, okay, where did this civilization exist? How can we know where this is? You'll get all sorts of answers from all sorts of people, and they haven't really dug it up yet. In fact, they haven't. And so it would make a lot more sense based on all these Mormon scholars. There's a good amount of people in the religion. They would have found it at this point, right? But they can't really tell you where it happened because they don't know. They don't have archaeological evidence to back it up. Meanwhile, when you go into Israel, right, when you go into the Middle East, you can find the ancient city of David, right, in Jerusalem. So this shows, even though there have been people who are skeptical that David was a historical person, what you find is there's lots of evidence, hard physical evidence, like in the ground, of his capital, of his nation, right? And so you see, those claims of the Old Testament are better from hard archaeological, secular evidence than the claims of the Mormons, who at this point should have been able to find at least some parts of their ancient civilization, so claimed. So you see that, there's some religions that don't even want to get into the tumble, the mix of historical claims of God working in history, which is fine. But when you look at it, these historical claims of God working, they're actually pretty good. And again, I have very limited time. There are other people who make good arguments. I would throw out Brand Petrie, John Bergsma, other people like this who back the historicity of the Old Testament and the New Testament that we also accept as Christians. But if you're a Mormon, and again, I don't assume any level of malice of any Mormon, but if you also say the Book of Mormon is important or canonical or inspired, you have a problem where there's no real historical evidence to back the events that are going on here. Okay? So we look at it not as skeptics, but from a more objective, I believe in faith, but I'm also trying to use my reason to see what's true, right? And we see that some religions make historical claims which are worse than others. Some religions don't get into the game at all, okay? So that's an important distinction of what we're talking about when it comes to if we can know anything about religion. We can know some things that are false about certain religions, but we can also know things that are true, right? Like the ancient city of David, okay? Very good. Okay. So the agnostic needs to remember these distinctions, right? But he also might be more doubtful that we can believe genuinely, right, in a true heart, or know many kinds of claims, yes, associated with religion, sure, but also with objective truth, morality, even secular history, philosophy. You get people who are extremely skeptical of anything, and it usually takes, it can take a couple of forms, right? There's different versions of this, but I think one of the most major ones boils down to the equivalent of saying, we can't know anything for certain, okay? Right, this claim, we can't know anything for certain. This is called skepticism. It was made more popular in the modern world by David Hume, the English philosopher, and he was at the time of the Enlightenment. But these skeptical claims have been going on since Socrates and Plato were on the scene in 4th century BC Greece, okay? So these claims have been around forever, and the next thing that I'm going to address, which is some version of scientism, we'll talk about what that means in a second, has also been on the scene since Socrates' day. So it's true that there's nothing new under the sun, as it says in the Bible, according to King Solomon. But, so anyway, we can't know anything for certain. We can't know anything for certain, right? So this leads to the easy argument or defeater, we would say in philosophy. It wins the day against it, summarized basically in asking, well, are you certain that we can't know anything for certain, right? So it's self-defeating. And there's many ways to put that, but it itself is a contradiction, right? Because you're saying a certain truth claim that we can't know anything for certain, right? So that itself beats your system on your own terms. And so there's really nothing more to say after that. You can take a kind of weaker argument or a more, I would say, yeah, probably intellectually stronger argument, right? And it says something like, we can only know for certain scientific truth. Okay, so we can know something for certain. And everything else is at best a good opinion, right? A good feeling or a good opinion. Okay, so I also think this doesn't work. There's more complex ways to address it, but for the sake of time, again, I'll show you why it doesn't work inherently or logically, right? So saying that only scientific claims are trustworthy or true cannot be verified through the very means. What they mean by scientific is the scientific method that started in the 16th century. And so if you only use that method, right, if you only think that's the source of truth or the highest level of truth, well then you can't put an immaterial principle or statement, right, some philosophical truth that we can only know scientific truths into the scientific method, right? The scientific method is only concerned about hard evidence, hard measurements, hard data. And so a sentence like that we can only know things through the scientific method, can't itself go through the scientific method to be proved, which again is the only way you can prove something according to this argument. So it itself, just like the other one, finds itself self-contradicted, a faulty argument at its heart. And again, there's more complex ways and nuanced ways to state this, and there's also good complex arguments to go against it, but again, I only have so much time. There's a good professor, Dr. Alex Plato at Franciscan University of Steubenville, who has arguments against it, so I can point you in the direction if you want to find out more. But yeah, so we see that these versions of agnosticism, which are concerned about knowledge whatsoever, what we can know whatsoever, find themselves contradictory, false, and so we have to go with the other side. If the one side is bad and doesn't make any sense, we have to go with someone on the other team, right? Okay, so what are the other teams? Well, one of them, as we talked about, is atheism, okay? So atheism is the stronger version of agnosticism, okay? So it's saying positively, or I assert, I claim, that God doesn't exist, right? So also imported into that is that we can know this with some level, and usually a good level of certainty, right? It's probable that God doesn't exist. We'll call that atheism, right? Very few atheists say, I know for sure God doesn't exist, or almost certainly. That's not most of them, I think. It's more of a probably. But that's still a strong claim, and you need evidence. Okay. So there's three big arguments among millennials, Gen Z, my generation, on why they don't believe in Christianity or religion. It was one of those two. And two of them were actually, basically, with different words, addressed and noted by St. Thomas Aquinas, the great doctor in the Catholic Church, just meaning great thinker in the Catholic Church, in the 13th century. So he addressed these and his arguments against them, but he also saw them as the only arguments that were really substantial or weighty towards the atheistic position, okay? And Thomas usually gave at least three arguments for any position he disagreed with. So he only saw these two as good. You caught, I mentioned three. We'll talk about the other one that Gen Z talks about. But just to know that these arguments aren't new. They're not like, it's not like a team of like 20 atheistic philosophers at Harvard or someplace that are coming up with these new arguments. Again, there's nothing new under the sun. They've been addressed, and I think pretty well by people other than me. I'm just a messenger. I'm your mailman. So the first argument, which is not addressed by Thomas, I'll say because it's not very good, honestly, intellectually. And he probably thought of this too, but didn't think it was very good intellectually. It is pretty good emotionally, and we all felt it because we've all lived it to some extent, which is that religious people or Christians are hypocrites. That's basically the argument. And so if someone's a hypocrite of a certain religion, well, the religion must be false because this person is, in a sense, false, right? Okay. Again, that is emotional pull and weight, and I think that affects all of us, right, to some degree, including me. But, it doesn't really hold water. Atheists will make positive claims on how the universe works, how we should live. You can't really live or, frankly, talk to anyone for more than 5 minutes without counseling them, giving them advice, giving them wisdom, so-called wisdom sometimes, but you have to give them moral exhortation or showing them implicitly or explicitly how to live, right? That's just like so central to human language, knowledge, everything we do, right? So atheists, which usually number themselves as humanists, and many of them are goodly motivated, right, when it comes to this, and also, just like being a good neighbor, right? An atheist doesn't want to see you die. An atheist doesn't want to see you fall and break your leg, right? So they're actually looking out for you, at least when it comes to the physical, material well-being of yourself, because atheism usually leads to materialism. That's a talk for another day. So, even so, what I'm trying to say here, atheistic humanists have positive principles that they try to live by, right? They try to be kind to people. They try to be nice. They try to not anger people. They try to help the environment, right? And things we have common ground on in many occasions. But they, too, do not live up to their principles, right? That's just experientially true. That just happens. And so, if we're going to say a religion is not true because people are hypocrites in it, we'd have to say atheism's not true because, and there's people who do philosophy. What does atheism lead to in terms of morality and moral systems? Okay? We would also have to say atheism's not true because people's behavior contradicts what atheism stands for, right? So, anyway, if you flip it on its head, what I'm trying to say, it doesn't work both ways. And so you're left with this not being an argument for any of the religious people, nor atheists, though. Okay. I will say, though, just as throwing it out there, I do think Christianity does help, though, in terms of, what evidence do we have for a belief system, a religious system, in terms of what it does for you? Like, does it make you good? Does it make you happy? These sorts of questions, which are important for people, and rightfully so, right? We're living as human beings. We want to be more happy. We want to be more joyful. We want to be more at peace. And so we ask those questions with that also in mind, or some questions more explicitly, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. That's not bad at all. But I think what you see here is, there's a famous quote by G.K. Chesterton where he basically says that Christianity has not been tried and found wanting or found lacking anything. It hasn't been tried, and for that reason, people have not received the goodness that God wants to give them, right? So it's difficult, Christianity, but at the same time, it gives a lot of grace, right, when we do it in full willingness and submission to God, okay? And so we see this in the lives of St. Maximilian Kolbe, right? St. Mother Teresa, St. John Paul II, these great figures who, said yes, their fiat, like Mary, to God, and the Holy Spirit took them from there, right? And so we see great joy, love, holiness, as much as we can have on this side of the earth. This is what we see in someone who wants to live by and receives the grace to live the Christian life. Okay, so the best argument against is also a quote, the best argument against Christians, or Christianity is Christians. I don't think it's actually true, but it's kind of funny to remember. But the best argument for Christianity is also Christians. Okay, so you get some saints too. And we're on a road to get there. We're trying. And so we also see some better arguments that Thomas articulates, that this poll that I found also articulates, okay? So one of these is basically that science contradicts religious faith, okay? If you've heard this before, I don't recommend you saying it like this in response to an atheist, but maybe in a circumspect, charitable way, saying something like, what scientific truth, okay, contradicted what religious dogma, how and with what level of certainty, overwhelming argument, and when was it, and who made it, and with what level of staying power today has it defeated all the other arguments? Okay, that was a mouthful. What I'm basically trying to say is that, you need to make a specific scientific claim, say how a scientific claim has been established, and then say how that contradicts this religious dogma, which again, we were talking about different religions. Most religions have a great amount of truth to them. We were talking about with Mormonism, it's not going to hold water that the Book of Mormon has historical veracity at the level of the Old Testament, for example, or the New Testament. And so we have to ask, what religion is it? Which scientific truth is it? And then how do we know that? With what level of certainty they contradict each other? Okay. So you got to get real specific with these claims. And sometimes they won't mention any, okay? And that gives them a chance to reflect. What do I know for certain? What am I assuming? Maybe I'll research it. And we believe God is the Logos, right? And so if you get someone moving down the reason track, that train might bring them full stop to, belief in God. You never know. So that's a good thing, actually, to be thinking about these things. Okay. Sometimes you will get an answer, though, okay? So one big one, just to throw out a word, is evolution, okay? The Bible contradicts evolution, macroevolution in particular. I don't think anyone really thinks microevolution didn't happen, okay? That's just like the white birds turned black because there was an explosion at the factory or something, and they're able to camouflage better than the white birds, right? So that's microevolution. Macroevolution is more like we came from monkeys and they came from lesser animals, kind of a thing. Okay, so first of all, if you're a Catholic, which most of you probably are, you can believe in evolution, okay? So you can believe in macroevolution. Now, certain things like you have to believe, like there's a historical Adam and Eve, human beings are the crown of creation, stuff like this, which, science doesn't contradict, right? When you look into the archaeological evidence of it too, it's not contradicted. But then Pope Benedict XVI, right? This great figure in the Catholic Church who was the Pope just like 9 years ago, he said evolution is more than a theory in a good way. So he's complimenting it, and he, as the Pope, even though, he's talking about a scientific claim here, and gets a little complicated, I don't have time to get into it, but it's still showing that a great thinker in the Catholic Church, certainly not someone who contradicts our Catholic intellectual tradition, is saying that you can believe it, okay? So there really is no argument. We can agree, right? Even if you don't agree with evolution, you can say that we can agree to disagree, and you can still be a theist. You can still be a Christian, okay? So the argument is moot. You can move on. Okay. Something else people will bring up is Galileo. Now that's a historical thing, right? So it's, rooted in history. That's good. Let's talk about history, right? So Galileo had a model that said, and I think Kepler before him or just after him, that basically the Earth, as we know it today, revolves around the sun, as opposed to what they used to understand, that the sun and all these other planets revolved around the Earth, okay? Heliocentrism, geocentrism, as we learned in our elementary school classes, right? So it's true that Galileo was correct on this, but two things are important to keep in mind here. The first thing is the Catholic Church doesn't teach geocentrism and never did in terms of an absolute dogmatic teaching, okay? So the Catholic Church didn't teach that. So again, the religion that most of us believe in, we think is true, doesn't say otherwise. So the argument is totally moot, right? The Catholic Church contradicted science, right? So you can just move on from there. The argument's over. We can agree. Catholic Church never said otherwise. And they waited on the science. And even if they treated him poorly, right, there's been bad bishops before, okay? Judas, right? He was a properly ordained bishop, the first one to take money from the government, but that's another thing for another time. And so, yeah, people act poorly, but again, that brings us to the first thing, And we already saw that doesn't prove atheism or disprove theism, okay? So the Catholic Church never disagreed with Galileo in terms of its dogmatic authority, in terms of what it's teaching with dogmatic certainty, backed by Jesus Christ, St. Peter, and the authority it's been given by the Lord. So, again, the argument is moot. It's dead in the water, right? In terms of a historical, just to say something real quick on it. In terms of a historical event, Galileo's models actually had less evidence than people who believed in geocentrism. Now, I believe in heliocentrism, right? Because most evidence is on that side, the most evidence. And in fact, a scientific consensus, an overwhelming majority, right, basically anyone, is in agreement that the Earth revolves around the sun. And I agree with that. But at the time, more evidence, more weight, substance in the argument and the scientific evidence was for geocentrism, right? The model had a hole in it. And when the model has a hole in it, and people can tell, scientists can tell, well, it doesn't have as much explanatory power as geocentrism. What you have is a bad theory. Even if it's true, it's not convincing, and you shouldn't believe something that doesn't have enough evidence, right? It could be true that, let's go back to our analogy. There's a fire truck that went down the road this morning, right? But let's say I got really into it and said, no, you're wrong about that. I called all the fire stations in nearby Nocati, Ponte Vedra, and they said no fire trucks left the stations this morning, absolutely zero. I would say, I have the evidence. You lose. I wouldn't say it like that, but I would say you lose. Now, we read on the news, we see on the news, tonight, actually, there was a fireman who went crazy up in Yulee and drove the truck through Nocati all around town. Okay, well, it turns out you were right, but at the time, it would have been reasonable to believe me, who had the arguments, all the nearby fire trucks wouldn't have gone out this morning. So you see that there's a certain level of trust in the arguments or weight in the arguments that you have to believe at a certain time to be reasonable. So it would have been more reasonable in Galileo's age to believe in geocentrism, okay, even though it's not now, okay. Running short on time here, we do want to do a Q&A because that's way better. The other kind of main argument, and it's pretty much the best argument and the most used by an atheist, is the problem of evil, okay? So if God exists, there shouldn't be any evil, or at least this level of evil, as we see in the world today, okay? And, there's many people who make many good arguments against this, better arguments for it, and I would point you, to them. You have for it Alex O'Connor. Against it, you have Dr. Peter Kraft, other philosophers who could make complex arguments with more time. But just to quickly cover it, so you kind of have two things, right, when you think about evil. And we're human beings, so let's get real practical, like what evils affect us the most, right? That would make someone believe that God doesn't exist, right? The Father of all lights, who gives us all these blessings, because of how bad some evils are. And some evils are really, really bad, right? That's all we see in the news. We know how bad some things are, okay? But there's basically two categories, and you can put them like the evil we do, okay? So moral evil, the evil that I will, otherwise known as sin. And this is kind of easier to explain, right? I'm not saying it's not painful or difficult to deal with or tough psychologically, but it's easier to explain intellectually, right? If we didn't have free will, that is, we would just be super complex monkeys, machines. We wouldn't actually be able to choose right or choose wrong. We wouldn't be human, properly speaking. But if we do have free will, then it makes sense, logically, that we could do evil. We could use our free will for evil. And so many people do that, right? And that's kind of the key one there. Now, the more complex one, and the one I think most people are having a problem with, struggling with, is the evil we suffer, okay? So again, I acknowledge this is harder to explain, and in order to really understand why this happens, we needed revelation, right? There's no logical proof I can give you to explain it that would satisfy you, even intellectually. So I think the key problem here in the very limited amount of time we have, and again, there's more to be said about this, so don't be like, Max didn't prove it, so, I'm not going to prove it. But it's really a probabilistic argument, okay? That the evil we suffer is so bad that God probably doesn't exist or definitely doesn't exist. That's a probabilistic argument because the person is assuming that the evil that we suffer, even if it's great, and oftentimes it is great, isn't worth it or can't be redeemed or used for a greater good, okay? And, when we're talking about these things, it's easier to have a hand to hold and an ear to listen to you, right? Especially God's. So I'm just giving you the intellectual stuff. But at the end of the day, it assumes that we can't use our suffering or that God can't use our suffering for good, right? And even think God out of it, that evil can't be used for good, that love is stronger than death, right? And so again, I pointed to, and I'll point back again, to Revelation, right? God himself, we believe as Christians, it's good evidence for this, that he really did take on a human body. God became man, the God-man, and he suffered the most out of anyone, even though he was the least worthy of such suffering, right? And so he uses this, although the worst sin was committed against him, deicide, right? You killed God. Even so, out of it comes the greatest thing that happened to human beings, which is salvation, right? Redeemed. And at the end of time, Thomas Aquinas talks about this, it will actually be better for the just that Adam and Eve fell, okay? Our glorified bodies, our state of being, our knowledge of God as the Trinity is known more well in heart and mind by those who are given the grace to be with him forever. And so we see that, it actually was a happy fault, according to the Psalms. Oh, happy fault that Adam fell. So again, much more to be said about that. And I didn't even get to arguments for theism. I do make arguments for that. This is a recording from last summer on the St. John Paul II YouTube page. You can look at that. But yeah, those are the arguments against. And again, if those two teams are bad, if the coaching staff is just awful and they don't serve any Gatorade during the games, well, you got to go to the only side left, which is theism, right? There's good arguments for it, but we didn't have time again. But all right, well, we'll give the time for the broadcast to end, but just a few seconds here. Thank you guys for listening. We'll do Q&A in just a second. Okay, any questions?